Welcome to Peer Check. I'm your host, Adam Keating, and on this episode, we're jumping into lessons learned from managing multi-billion-dollar supply chains as an engineering leader across multiple industries. Today, I'm joined by Greg Smyth, an engineering leader who's now taking what he's learned and become a content creator focused on career pivots, helping people go from traditional industry into high-tech jobs. He's taken what he's learned to actually do that successfully and moving from ExxonMobil into leadership roles at Tesla and offering coaching and supports for people making that transition. Greg has led programs offshore. He's led autopilot and global stamping teams at Tesla, and I'm really excited to have him here today. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Appreciate it and look forward to it.
Awesome. So, Greg, you've obviously gone through a bit of this transition yourself, figuring out, from engineering school into being an engineer to like really quickly moving up through your own career progression. How did you end up becoming a manager, and what took you into supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, those are maybe two different questions. I think my first time becoming an engineering leader was at Exxon, managing the engineering team for the Russian drilling team. It was a big Russian team. I managed the early planning that happened in Houston. I think the way I got promoted, or that first promotion, was to become a great engineer, and to get, I'd worked for 5 or 6 years, kind of in the trenches of drilling wells offshore, doing operational experience in a couple of different projects. And then also typically at Exxon, they would get you to do other kind of more business, well-rounded roles before you do that. So I worked in this business planning function and this issues management team, which was really like an external affairs, an external affairs advisor. And then I was kind of promoted from there. I think the tricky transition that a lot of the first time managers go through is I think it is one of the biggest transitions of your career. And what made me a great engineer or individual contributor does not make you a great engineering manager.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, it actually can be counter to that. Like, what made you a great engineer will make you a bad manager. And that might be true across disciplines, but I think especially for engineers, there's a lot of behavior that doesn't translate that well.
It's funny, Greg. I actually read a post yesterday talking about 5 things of letting go, things like delegating, letting go of your own individual contributor roles, like really giving people the authority and like not taking for granted what you learned as an individual contributor and actually educating people on that. I know you focused a lot in both your roles on the performance of your team and being a really good coach for those people. Why was that so important to you?
Well, I had this realization, if you manage a small team, so say if you manage 3 or 4 or 5 engineers, the manager can have a meaningful output, right? So they might have a quarter or 25% of the output of the team. Mm-hmm. But I was managing a team of 10, then almost 20. And your output is just not that big. And
yeah.
You can work, say, 80 hours a week, but largely your individual output just doesn't matter anymore. And I think, I spent the first 5 or 7 years of my career trying to become hyper efficient and productive and trying to maximize my individual output. And then when you get into a leadership role, you kind of have that same mindset, but it just doesn't work. Your individual output just doesn't matter that much. And so that was when I really shifted gears, that, hiring the right people and then coaching them to hopefully perform at their highest level or something close to that. And then ensuring they're working together in a meaningful way. Those 3 things put together, that drives the output of the team by 95%. And your individual, I kind of use this analogy, you're kind of like a conductor or of the team. You're not really, providing a meaningful amount of the output. And so I think having that realization, it took time. It wasn't a clear thing, but that realization just that's how a high performing team works typically.
It's funny because I think when you go back to those 3 points are really key. And if you start with the hiring front, what were you doing at Tesla, and Exxon to get these people? And when they came on board, how are you getting them integrated in a way that's effective? Because we hear a lot today about scaling problems, retention. How are you doing that to create not only the culture to attract people there, but then also keep them? What was working for you?
Yeah, I think trying to find the right, I mean, a lot of the time you're getting people with the aptitude required. Um, so you typically, once they get to the hiring manager, they generally are qualified for the job.
Hmm.
A lot of the time we're looking for like the intangible. Like when you go through the interview process, it's like you're trying to look for cultural fit.
Hmm.
And like the two main companies I work for were starkly different, like culturally. Um, and really looking for people that will be successful or likely successful in those organizations, this makes a huge difference. Because if you're just used to being a process oriented, structured decision making, those kind of things, you're going to be successful in a certain kind of organization. But in a startup environment where it's dynamic and changing, moving quickly, decisions are happening with limited information, like people struggle in that environment. And I tried to be, it's romantic to want to go work for an exciting startup, and I'm sure you
Yeah.
deal with this all the time. But I'm like, the reality of that is like a lot of pain and
Oh yeah.
challenge and like perpetual, problems everywhere. And it's like,
Yeah.
unless you're excited about that, then you're probably not in the right place.
Yeah, one of the people on the team today said to me that, if you're not expecting growing pains in a high growth company, then you're setting yourself up from failure right from day one.
Yeah.
I think that's totally true, right? And, the opposite's also true. If you're stagnant, then you're feeling a different kind of pain. And you got to pick which one you're going after here. And one thing you said to me a couple of years ago when we first met was about how much you thought about coaching those individuals once they were in to get the
Yeah.
best out of them, like going out of your way to do even one-on-ones with a huge group. Talk a
Yeah.
little bit about like what people can tangibly do to do more than just manage work scope. Because I know for me, coming into managing, there's a misconception on what that is. A manager versus a coach. Your title might be manager, but I think what you said earlier was to be that conductor for the team. What worked for you that was kind of unique in how you approached the team?
Yeah, I think, well, one, like maybe just on the cultural thing, I tried to have this mindset for, I used to use this analogy to say, like, when these huge waves are coming crashing on the shore, we need to be the team that grabs our surfboards and runs into the water, not the ones that are like scared and run away from it. And so it's like the challenge is big. It's like the biggest waves ever, and it may like swallow you up, but we need to be the team that runs towards the wave and not away from it. And like framing things that way makes a difference, because like the problem can be the same, but like, are you excited about solving it, or are you kind of like annoyed and frustrated? Because like that mindset makes a big difference. The coaching part, one really important distinction I think when you're coaching is that you need to coach the individual and not
Hmm.
the work itself. And I think a lot of individual contributors and managers like focus on the work problems.
Hmm.
And it's sort of like a teach a person how to fish analogy. And it's like a lot of the time people come to their manager like wanting them to solve the problem, right? Or provide insight on how to solve it. And a lot of it is like from a coaching perspective, it really is tempting to help people solve the problem, right? And it's like it's easier for you in the short term, it's easier for them in the short term, but it's like helping them think through to solve to learn how to solve these problems without your intervention in the future is like ultimately better for you, it's better for the individual, but it takes more time,
Hmm.
and it takes more patience and listening, where as a manager, theoretically you were probably the best individual contributor and you probably do have the answer, and you don't want to like withhold it, but you also want to help them like think through
Bro.
the logic and grow, right? Because it's like because a big part of it, and we can talk more about this, is like my ultimate goal was like to replace myself, and like kind
Yeah.
of constantly thinking about like, could the team survive without me? Could someone come into my place? Was
Hmm.
there two or three people within the team that had that capability or like on that
Hmm.
trajectory? And you really need to be growing people to be able to do that. And that's beneficial for me, because like for me, I was wanting to take on more responsibility, but that's what other people want too. They want growth. They want to be on a similar trajectory, not to feel like there's kind of a shrinking pie of opportunity.
It's funny because I actually say the same thing. I always say my goal is to basically fire myself from the job I'm currently in and move on to the next thing, right? And that's ultimately what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to teach people how to do a job really well and not do the job for them. And it's hard. Like I struggle with it still today. It's a really hard problem when things are.
It's an easy
intense.
thing to say, like for even me to say it, but I would say the part of it that managers need to get comfortable with is like there is a real vulnerability in it, because it's not just that they need to solve the problem themselves, but like legitimately probably will get it wrong some part of the time and making mistakes. And being comfortable with the team making mistakes and learning from them, like that is, most managers, especially new ones, just don't want to make mistakes. They don't want their team to make mistakes, and so they're kind of continuously trying to prevent those mistakes from happening. But that will just limit your personal growth, your team's growth, and your team's performance, really.
How did you get buy-in in like two very high-performing cultures to take that long-term approach to people? Like I think in hindsight, like saying it out loud sounds easy in hindsight, and like looking at the day-to-day, that's a very tough call almost every single time. How did you get buy-in from like your team and maybe your leadership to say, I'm investing in the people and not the short term?
I don't know if you really need, I don't know, like, I don't know if it takes a lot of buy-in. I would say like, you don't really need permission from like your senior managers only care about results, right? Yeah. And so for the large part, I mean, they care about you delivering results. And so the important thing is to deliver on those results and set those expectations. But like the how you do it is kind of up to you as an individual. And I think that, that's up to you. And I think it's, well, I should say though, like the importance of the support from the senior leadership of the tolerance for failure makes a huge difference, because when you do give that autonomy, when you do give that space to people and they do make mistakes, then what is their response? Like, even if you have this kind of like balanced response, if the executive in the team or that you report to does not, then it will just tamp out that that culture. And so I would say their risk tolerance and their acceptance of failure and how that's handled is super important. I'll just give you one like quick analogy. Like from like my early career, I was an engineer, and we were doing this like pushing like drilling speeds in my team a lot, and we were smashing like every record like that had existed for a very long time, but we pushed too far. And this was a lesson for me, but like in the way my manager at the time held it, we pushed it too far, and we just like failed a couple of times in a row. But the way my manager handled it then, I still think about this, was I was like, I'm still not sure why we failed. I know we pushed really hard, but we did like a legitimate like post-mortem on what happened. And he just didn't cast judgment too early and just said, all right, like I trust you and the team that you look at it appropriately and come back with like what the answer is. And he just came back with an honest answer that's likely we pushed too hard. But he gave us the space to do that and didn't just like shoot us as soon as we had failed. Like we're not doing this again. And I think that kind of message mattered a lot to me, as like a willingness to take risk, and that failure, was not good, but and we needed to understand what happened, but how he handled that made such a difference to my, how safe you feel taking risk in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an important one, right? Like I think you talked about the coaching element and doing one-on-ones. Being able to give people comfort that they can come to you and be vulnerable is a really important thing as a leader, or else you're not going to get the truth. You're going to get it when they're walking out the door, going on to that next job, and then at that point it's too late, right?
Well, I think the coaching part needs to be bi-directional too, right? It's like you're not this omniscient person that knows everything, and I think that makes a difference. Like, and I talk like what coaching I think is a good analogy, and I mean I grew up playing sports a lot. Like coaching is such a normal part of, LeBron James has a coach, like the best tennis players in the world have coaches. And so, and even like from a feedback standpoint, getting very comfortable that like I was trying to be coaching all the time, like every day, every meeting, every interaction was sort of a mini coaching session. I think where a lot of managers get it wrong, or leaders, is that they coach too infrequently. So they're coaching like by every quarter or twice a year during performance reviews. It's way too late. And then it also stings harder when you only
Yeah.
get coached periodically, and it tends to be only negative,
Yeah.
but it's like doing it frequently, balancing positive to negative, like those things matter a lot to people.
How often did you do one-on-ones with your team?
Weekly, if the team is not too big, you can't do a huge team weekly. Ideally, weekly is the best cadence I find. And I find like that is the main meeting. If you effectively run one-on-ones, like you can run an entire team like with and I think people are like, how do you afford to do that? But a lot, well, not say most, a lot of managers tend to attend a lot of their
Yeah.
like individual teams meetings, and they just don't need to. And you can get basically through one-on-ones, you can get like you can basically be coaching and staying up to speed on a lot of those things without having to attend a lot of the downstream ones.
What did your structure look like when it worked best? Like how long were they? How did you balance sort of the feedback you gave versus the feedback you received? What was that structure that worked in the end?
Yeah, like 30 minutes seems like enough, but I also put the onus on the individual. Like it wasn't my meeting, it was their
Okay.
meeting to run, so they set the agenda. And there was probably like say 20 minutes at a minimum would be maybe like for their time, their agenda, things they wanted to discuss, like issues, priorities, feedback they were looking for. And then the last 5 to 10 minutes would be kind of my time to provide coaching or feedback or any other thing else that happened during the week that I wanted to talk about or topics that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've definitely balanced between like the frequency and length and structure, and that sounds pretty close on to what's working best. And I like that. And I guess in summary of all this, like one of the biggest things you've probably taken away, which obviously worked for you, is that, moving up into an engineering leadership role is not just about managing people. It's about making people better. It's about coaching them and actually investing in that, because the other stuff is short term. This stuff is long term. This is the hard part. This is what differentiates, I think, good productive results driven leaders, and then the ones who actually inspire people to stick around and do something generational. Like, you did a Tesla and at ExxonMobil. I'm curious, like, to kind of jump a little bit deeper here. How did the supply chain make this harder? Because it's easy enough when you have one team to think about, but the second you're really thinking about an extended family of groups to worry about and how they all play together and things that are your control, how did you handle the pressures and uncertainties of supply chain with your own team's morale amongst all of this?
Yeah, like once like managing the internal teams, I'll say, is quote unquote easy. It's like once you go outside your own walls, you just have influence but not control, and it gets exponentially difficult to nudge people in certain directions. I think that like the single biggest learning, it's the same response to people. It's the cultural fit for suppliers is the same or maybe more important than well, they're technical. I mean, you need to have like basic technical competence and be able to perform the like build a product or whatever it might be. But gaining cultural alignment, having the right like suppliers and partners on board just makes such a huge difference. And I think you can coach someone that's capable and is kind of culturally aligned. You can coach them to like unbelievable heights. And I think the same is true for suppliers. But if you have someone that's either and is not capable and or is not culturally aligned, and it could be, say, a mom and pop that's just like not sophisticated enough to be working with like a Fortune 500 company, or it could be a company that's just like too big. It's like a too like supplier that's like too big and antiquated and is not set up to work to be an agile supplier. Either of those can fail for different reasons, but you can't coach those people to fit your culture. And I think like one of the lessons would be for me is that you probably should not like like desource those suppliers when you can. And I think like realizing though how intertwined you get with these partners, it becomes very difficult to do that. So being thoughtful about which partners you decide to work with, because you're kind of going to be stuck with them forever, or be very difficult to disentangle, like to to like unwind the relationship, it makes you realize that the importance of that. And I mean, the real way to mitigate some of that risk and to make sure incentives are aligned is to have multiple supply options. Like having dual supply tends to de-risk a lot of the supply chain aspects, but it ensures that it keeps the suppliers honest. Because if they have a single source and they know it, they will tend to behave in a certain way. But if they're continuously competing for allocation of supply, it will keep them honest and for much longer periods of time.
So it's kind of two trains here, right? You've got new suppliers and then you've got your existing ones. Existing ones are harder to really deal with. I'm going to start with the new suppliers. Something you said there was that you want to find more than just technical fit. Like, can they supply me the widget? Are they the one I want to work with? And I think a lot about this with who we partner with at Colab. I'm curious how you do this though in the manufacturing world, because there's so many variables. It's like you could have a mom and pop shop who are amazingly brilliant and perfect for you, and you could have a gigantic company with big brand who just culturally misaligns from what you're trying to do as a company. How did you actually suss that out in a way that doesn't feel subjective when you're picking your suppliers?
I think we would certainly do assessments, objective assessments as best we could. And then I do think dual supply is one way to manage it. Depending on the commodity, it's like a luxury that sometimes you just can't have, depending. But for certain commodities, like dual supply is a way to mitigate that. And then I think as you're growing a supply chain, you want to kind of adjust it over time. It's like if you launch a new program, you don't want to start with like a brand new supply chain, right? Yeah. I think you want to go with like, maybe you trim out some of the suppliers that are not performing well. You add in a small group of new ones that you're experimenting with. And I think over time, you should be kind of continuously doing that, where you're trimming suppliers that are not performing well, adding ones that you think are a good fit. And then you can kind of increase and allocate more and more to them based on their performance. Because if you just go all in, even if it seems like on the surface to be a perfect fit, just like in the courting phase of starting these relationships, a lot of things can seem amazing, and just the realities of what manifests down the road, you just don't know. And I think it's almost impossible to like fully predict it. And so I think you want to manage it like in a reasonable way, and then start to like migrate over time. And then over time, you're kind of moving towards this optimized supply chain, opposed to like, okay, we're going to get this perfect one and kind of go from there.
Even just the state of the world right now, you'd kind of need to have some optionality, because you may have a great supplier and literally not be able to get the thing you need because of the way the world's shaping up right now. So,
well, I was in preparation for this, I was thinking about it, and I've listened to some podcasts recently on like supply chain is such a complex, it's not just one thing even. It's logistics, it's inventory management. I did really the purchasing and supplier quality aspects of it, but there's so many stakeholders involved there, and it's global. There's thousands of suppliers like that are providing parts, but then also like all these ancillary things in the middle. It's actually incredible when you really start to understand it. How does this happen? It's amazing that it works at all, in honesty.
I just bought a Model 3. I think I told you just a little while ago. I bought a Model 3 in August. It was supposed to come in October. It then got pushed out to October 2022. And I was like, oh, no, that's not good. And then I got a call last week that it's on the way. But I actually think to myself, like, I understand why it was being pushed out. I get what's going on sort of in that supply chain. And I'm actually shocked it's coming. I'm actually like impressed that it's showing up, just given everything else that's going on right now to make this so difficult.
Well, I think you'll also see I think the vulnerability of certain companies. You'll realize like the trend of, I don't know the specific time frames, but was to move to outsourcing, right? A lot of the manufacturers went to, really they were just like assembling plants and outsourced everything to suppliers. And I think that was probably great from an efficiency standpoint. It's like it reduces the amount of capital investment you have to do. There's a lot of reasons to do it. But you also like give up control largely, and so your supply chain is just not adaptive, and so that's probably exposed, like that weakness in companies has been exposed in the last couple of years. If you don't have some reasonable amount of vertical integration, dual supply, those kind of things, then you'll struggle more. I'll say that much.
Do you think there's going to be a massive change in the next 5-10 years? Like, I've been hearing a lot of trends about people moving manufacturing back to the US, for example. People thinking about literally doing what you just described, more vertical supply chain, like fully integrated setups. Like, people are thinking about all these things. Do you really think there's going to be a massive shift? And if so, like, where do you think first people should look?
I don't know. I'm not really an expert to maybe offer a meaningful input, but I do think like the COVID has just stressed the system in a way that is going to push people to do things differently. And so I do think there'll be more domestic supply, there'll be dual supply to different countries. Like I do think there'll be a whole, and that's probably happening like in real time to de-risk these things in the future. The other part of it that you don't realize, like there's such a fine balance of inventory. It's like you want to have this like perfect machine that has low inventory levels, but then is also like not prone to supply shocks, and so how you do that is just like it's a very tricky balance to strike. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be this huge like localization to everything in the US. I think there's going to be a balance of things that will come back domestic that's high IP, that's like important to have secured. And I think you'll see dual global supply chains. You'll see all kinds of, and even innovation in that space, like smart inventory tracking, those kind of things.
Without going, just before we get off the supply chain topic, we talked a little bit about, sort of new suppliers and how to think about that. Also think about resiliency in your own supply chain with having, dual supply options, having like, trimming some of the fat and bringing in some new players as you're moving between programs. When you have an existing supplier though, and you're on a key program, you're on a tight deadline, you're trying to deliver, something as complicated as the Model 3 program, or you're going offshore building this massive rig and you have a timeline you're trying to hit. What have you done or what have you seen that's worked to get you out of the pickle? Because I hear this all the time now about we're working with a supplier, we're constantly having design problems, we're having supply chain issues, we're having all this, and you're stuck, right? Like it's really hard to get out of that. Is there an example, and you can keep it general, but is there an example of something that went astray that you guys actually figured out a clever way to fix, just in terms of like how you worked with that group to kind of just put a Band-Aid on it to deliver on time and then, worry about the long-term solution later?
Yeah. I don't like, there's not a specific example there. The biggest challenge, I think the closer to the deadline you get, the hard, I think I kind of wrote this before. It's like the closer you get to the deadline, it just the harder and more expensive it gets. So like, and so if you can try and like solve these problems, like, and it doesn't have to be 2 years in advance, but 2 weeks in advance, it's like impossible to solve some of these constraints. And so doing things out in front matters a lot, because otherwise you end up, it's so far from optimal. You're using what I call like brute force to make things happen. And you can do a lot with brute force, with the right supplier that's culturally aligned, that is willing to be scrappy and do things differently. You can make a lot happen in a very short period of time. And I think maybe that's the way to do it, is that being willing to meet a crazy deadline or do things in a short period of time. You had to be willing to do probably some unconventional things to make things happen in the near term. But then I think having buy-in, like once you get to mass production or to the final project deliverable, that you're willing to move to what the optimized solution is, and that you're not stuck with this like kind of suboptimal solution that you built just to launch a product quickly, and to be aligned with that approach, because other companies or suppliers just like would kind of be unwilling to do that. They're used to launching products in a certain way, and so you had to have them culturally on board to be able to have something like that approach.
Are there certain things that you did with suppliers directly, similar to how you coached the people on your internal team, that worked to like foster and build that relationship? Like, what did it look like for you to actually build those relationships? Because I think so often it's a lot of finger pointing in supply chain. This thing's late, this thing's broken, whose fault is it? And I think the teams that are working best are the ones you just described. They're the ones that roll up their sleeves together, agree that this thing is, kind of messed up, not a good situation, but we need to push through it. What worked for you in building that kind of like true relationship with suppliers?
I mean, I think it's the same. I mean, they're all people. It's like whether they work for you directly or indirectly. Yeah. And I think, but what I saw, I mean, you can't disclose everything, right, from like internal to external, but trying to be as honest as you can with people, and honest and direct about what your expectations for them are, how they're performing to the level you're expecting or not expecting. And I think it also goes the same way that you need to be receptive to how you as a company is not performing. It's kind of easy because there's sort of a power dynamic between the customer and the supplier. And you can use that, right? That is a point of leverage that you have as the person like holding the bag, we'll say. But you can't overuse that. And you can use it, but it will erode the trust and engagement of the supplier over time. And you really want to create this ideally you're creating a mutually beneficial relationship. And you need to have a high level of trust between those individuals, those teams. And I think having an open and honest discussion, and it has to be bi-directional to make those things happen. I think the second part that's a little more nuanced is like the incentives have to be aligned. That's right. So it's like the mutually beneficial part that, if you are trying to grow a company and then your supplier's trying to do the same, that those incentives are aligned, and that's what they want. Because if they're not incentivized to grow, kind of if they make less money as they grow or something like that, then they're just not going to do what you want them to do. But if they have a big pie and they have a big empty factory that they're trying to fill or something, like those incentives, human behavior is driven a lot by incentives. And so understanding even how the contracts are structured, understanding what their individual goals are will make a huge difference to like the long-term performance of those suppliers.
Let me ask you something just on that, because a lot of the things you've actually shared, like you're an engineer by background, you've been in engineering leadership roles, you've obviously moved in supply chain, different places, but like what portion of your job do you actually think is pure engineering versus like more of a business and like coaching role? Because what I think most people get wrong, and you said it earlier on, that oftentimes the best technical person becomes the manager, and I think of it as two tracks, right? Your best technical person may become the manager, they may also become your SME, and that's totally cool. That's actually very important for every company. How do you think about that? Like when you were at that point there, a couple of years ago before you jumped into helping people pivot their careers, would you consider yourself to be more of a coach and like business relationship manager than an actual like engineering focused manager? Like, what do you think? Because I feel like a lot of the advice you're giving me could apply to things I'm struggling with right now, building software.
Well, I think it definitely migrated. Like I was a real engineer for probably the first 5 or 6 years of my career, like doing this real design, operational design, those kind of things. And then you definitely, I mean, I think engineering offers this like toolkit of problem solving that is applicable so broadly that I just kind of started to branch out beyond that. And it's early at Exxon did different roles like that, and Tesla certainly. And I think the part of supply chain I liked so much was that it was almost half and half. Like half of the team that reported to me was supplier quality engineers. So that work was very engineering, kind of technical, quality focused. And then the other half was global supply manager, so managing, supply, but largely the commercial relationships. And seeing and I think a lot of the discussion, I mean, some of it's like the people side, but seeing how the commercial aspects of the business relationship, the money part, ties into quality. And like those things are not mutually exclusive or separate entities. They're like inherently enmeshed, and there's just like a continuous like interaction with those things. And I loved. Like I loved the business aspect, negotiating, the pricing aspect, doing RFQs, those things, but also like solving tough engineering problems, understanding how to set up good quality systems, how to root cause analysis. Like, and I'm not really a quality engineer, and that's a very legitimate skill set. and I had some exceptional quality engineers work for me that that really understood like how to understand a root cause analysis of a problem, how to understand
Yeah.
materials, like all these kind of things. And but yeah, that combination of commercial and engineering made, I think, my supply chain role really fascinating.
It's I think it's special, to be honest. We've hired a lot of engineers working at Colab, and just the mindset. Like if I think back to when I went through school, what I took from that. I mean, I don't use my thermodynamics background, my fluids background most days here, but the problem solving piece is like a really, really beautiful thing to pull into a management role when you apply it in ways that are like against a business problem or against a human problem, because you can just think about it rationally and sift through a lot of mud, I'll say, in solving that stuff. So one thing I'm curious about through all this, Greg, like obviously you've been an incredible coach to your team and supply chain. You've learned about the difference and kind of like just managing and like being human with these people to get the most from that group to deliver, you know, the results you're trying to deliver. What was the biggest difference between doing this in energy, which might have been like really focused on a drilling program versus like a very conventional automotive supply chain? Like, is there anything that any advice you'd give to a manager or an engineering leader that is different between the two? And then I'll jump for the last part, how you bridge the gap. I'm curious to kind of dive into how you jump from energy to automotive.
Yeah, I mean they're different worlds in so many ways. I've thought about this a lot, and just even the dynamics of mass manufacturing versus like kind of not mass manufacturing, whatever you want to call it. Like, you know, you're kind of doing like we were drilling 4 wells a year, right? And so you need like 8 sets of equipment or something for the entire
Mm-hmm.
year. And so just the dynamics of doing like long, we'd plan like an oil well for 6 months, and then you'd execute it over like a 3 month period. And just like the different dynamics, and you'd have like a very small supply chain, relatively small supply chain for like the entire well might have 8 or 10 suppliers. And then into automotive where you're doing this mass manufacturing and you're bringing in huge amounts of inventory continuously. Supply base is gigantic, although like I manage like kind of a small portion of it. But those dynamics are just like starkly different. And it took me, when I first went to Tesla, I was buying big capital equipment, which was like a similar dynamic. You're kind of buying big pieces of equipment to go in like a small number of factories. But
Mm-hmm.
when you shift into what's called like direct materials purchasing, it's that you're buying car parts effectively, but like the approach of doing that is just quite different. I think like the thing that I struggled with most was to make decisions with limited information, and it goes back to like risk taking, being comfortable with that, and to
Mm-hmm.
make the best using what we'll say is your gut or some informed judgment to make the best decision you could. And that's like, again, that sounds easy in principle to do, but it's like it's kind of scary. And when you're used to like, my past life, it was kind of perfection and trying to
Mm-hmm.
drive, really not make any mistakes. And there's
Yeah.
different levels of consequences in the two businesses, which differentiate them a little bit. But being comfortable that you may not pick the right supplier or that you may not do something perfectly, and be willing to be okay with that and to realize that you could probably repair it or adjust it over time. Like that was the thing I probably struggle with most.
It always comes back to risk. Like if you look at that, like if you looked out in the world right now, like
I'm
think
not
about
sure I
security,
understand.
there are so many things that are a potential risk to happen. And it really comes back to like, is it a risk for you in your particular situation? And what is the actual impact of getting that right? But it's a scary thing. Like it's a scary transition to make. And
Yeah, I
I
mean, I
think the
think
last,
you start to hone your whatever judgment is, like or
Mhm.
instinct. Sometimes I call them, and I think you had to be at a certain stage of your career to be more comfortable. Like when you're right out of school, I would say your judgment or instinct is probably not that great, but I think is
Mhm.
it's something you kind of hone over time. And again, it's not perfect, but you have a sense for over like decision making, those kind of things, and making mistakes in the past, and even like using your collective judgment. It's not even just like your individual judgment, right? It's like your collective judgment, the judgment of your executives and even like
Mhm.
counterparts and things like that. You had to depend on that more. And I think there's also an element that I hadn't really considered before, to there's a opportunity cost of not making the decision. and being
Yeah.
thoughtful over making the theoretical right decision in 6 months from now has a cost, that that may be more than making the wrong decision now. And I think thinking about it that way was just different from what I was used to.
Yeah, people are always saying to me a wrong decision is better than no decision. And in a lot of cases, as long as the risk profile is not going to blow something up or cause some long term irreplaceable or irreversible damage, it is true, because sitting there and sitting in status quo and not actually changing what's going on is oftentimes the biggest risk. Like if you think about security breaches, most times it's because people don't actually tackle things that they know have been outstanding for 5 years, not because of a new piece of software they introduced. So it's a very interesting perspective. Greg, one thing that I know you've done a lot is you shared a bunch of resources with me and how to become better at what I'm trying to do, better at what friends are trying to do in the engineering world. And obviously you're coaching people now for a living on how to make these pivots. What are you reading, or what would you suggest an engineering leader read to get better at more the human element of being a coach versus just a manager, both for their team and supply chain?
Yeah. The book, this is like an old school book, but the book that like changed my life, I think, would be The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I think it stood the test of time in many ways. And it really can be a handbook for your own personal development for a long time. And the way it's structured is like the first 3 habits are internally facing. And so you can almost spend the first 5 years of your career just doing the first 3 habits basically. And then the second 3 habits are like interdependence, and it's really like how you work with others. And so that book, I think, gave me the tools for both. It's like sort of, I don't want to say I have self-mastery by any means, but like it does give you like a good framework for internal mastery, like how to understand yourself and work on development. But then also, like as you go into this interdependence, how you work with others, it really does a good job at like describing those things, differentiating that they're different things. And the best analogy in there, it showed this point of leverage, right? That it showed as an individual, you have this like kind of teeter-totter that like as you put 1 unit of energy in, you get 1 unit out. But once you become a leader or a manager, that like fulcrum slides in one direction. And so now 1 unit of energy can produce like 5 units of energy out. And like understanding that in my mind was like, and you realize you just can't do that much stuff on your own, right? Even if you're the most productive engineer in the world. And so that's why I think even the SMEs, like especially, Exxon had a phenomenal group of SMEs. They were the ones that were most effective, were phenomenal communicators, influencers, and like ability to like, because you just can't do that much on your own. You can be like the best engineer, but if you don't have like interpersonal communication skills, ability to influence others, like not manipulate them, but to like be able to persuade people of your ideas, then you're really just going to limit how much impact you have, how far your ideas spread, those kind of things.
Yeah, I like that takeaway. Individual contributor, kind of 1 in, 1 out, and looking at it from like a leadership perspective, depending on where you put the fulcrum, you could be 1 in, 20 out if you do it right. It's kind of it's a good way to look at it. And,
well, I think you realize the higher you go, I mean, for you as a CEO, like the consequences are bigger too. So like your good decisions are amplified, but your bad ones are too. And so it does create more pressure, but it's like that's why it's important. Anyways, it's important in both directions.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting thing that I actually did. So I found myself doing too much of the individual contributor work, and it's hard scaling this fast, and like being a founder and CEO, 2 different jobs, very different jobs. Founder, very scrappy. CEO should be a leader. And one of the things we found we went through was looking at our actual time and where we invested time. And I read this book that talked about basically scoring your own calendar for admin work versus individual contributor work versus management versus like strategy and like truly coaching. And basically giving you a dollar value for those hours, like $10 for admin, 100 for the individual contributor, 500 for management, and 5,000 for strategy. And I basically said then, how would you feel about spending your calendar that way you currently are versus what you said you'd do if this actually came back and how much you made? And you're like, Well, that's what you're doing to your team, right? You're cutting your team short because they're expecting you to deliver 10x, and you're only doing admin work, which isn't getting you even close, even if you worked 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
That was a really keen takeaway. So I like the 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 20 out.
Yeah, it's so easy, because I think even if you're a great individual contributor, there's something like super satisfying about being a great individual contributor.
Yeah.
It's like a part of like mastery. It's like being good at something, and it's just super tempting to want to do that. And I think there is like a little bit of a balance. I think like a manager still needs to be like a great individual contributor, but it has to be like 15% of their time or something.
The right slice.
Yeah, or it has to be like something super strategic that they maintain responsibility for, or because it's some way to keep your saw sharp, as like that's what is part of the 7 Habits book. And so you can't just be like kind of the conductor that's always monitoring things happening. You need to be like in the trenches. You need to be maintaining and growing like an individual contributor skill set. So there's like there is like that balance that you kind of need to be going back and forth between.
Yeah, and it's the same framework, right? Like it doesn't say cut everything out. It's about weighting it properly, because you'll burn out too, right? If you're in one of those buckets completely, you'll lose either the part you love, you'll stop learning, you'll lose something that makes you not the same leader that got you to where you were, which is like, an interesting take. Greg, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you jumping in and talking us through sort of how you take a human approach to both your team, supply chain, and even your career. Thanks so much for joining, and I'm looking forward to diving in deeper next time.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. And good luck in future episodes. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. All right, take care.